I spent over 100 hours combing through reading journal videos, brainstorming, and then making these spreads to bring you over 100 layout ideas for your reading journal. This one is going to be a long one, so grab a pen and paper, get comfy, and let's pick out your next reading journal layouts. To make this video a little bit easier to navigate, we do have chapters for each of the different kind of sections of the reading journal layout ideas, but our first one is just reading journal ideas in general. Having a page of this in your reading journal means that when you want to set something up, maybe do something a little more creative, you have a go-to list of things that you've been interested in making at some point. I put this one at the very front of my reading journal so that I have it there as a handy reference, and the ideas that are captured in this one are going to be things that we have coming up, though I couldn't quite fit 100 on this page. I like to set mine up just as a simple list, sometimes with checkboxes first so that I can tick them off as I make them in my journal. Flipping over though, and then into our first kind of main section, this is all about the reference materials that you put into your reading journal. One of the references that I do like to have up the front is a rating scale breakdown. This just helps for when I go to rate the books that I'm reading, making sure that I'm being as consistent as possible in applying my rating scale. I like to rate my books from 0 to 5 stars, including half stars, so I have each of those written out here with a little descriptor of what that star rating actually means. On this kind of a page, you can also put questions that you ask yourself when it comes to rating your books. For instance, if you use the core pile system, you could put in a little descriptor for what that actually means. And you might also like to distinguish how you rate different reads based on genre, or fiction versus non-fiction. If you have a different rating system for manga and graphic novels, those kind of things could get captured on here. The next reference that you might want to have is a genres list, in particular the genres that you actually like to read. This one could be set up kind of like a checklist, so you're kind of doing a genre exploration, trying to get in and read all of those different genres and subgenres. Or it could just be a reference list that you use when you're shelving your books on Goodreads or something like that. I've just set this one up in 3 separate columns, but depending on how widely you read, you might need more space than this. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. If you're just getting into the bookish community, kind of like myself, then something like a book-related acronyms and terms list could be useful. We have the common ones like TBR, to be read, DNF, did not finish, but then also some other ones that maybe you're not as familiar with. I know that when I wrote out this list, I wrote down HEA, and it took me such a long time to figure out that that was happily ever after. For each of these though, you just list out the term or phrase, and then write in what that term or phrase actually means. Another reference list that you might want to put into your reading journal could be triggers or warnings. In particular, the ones that are your no-goes, the ones that you're trying to avoid. If it says that that's in the book, you're probably not going to read it, versus the ones that are okay, or the ones that it kinda depends on the context. If I were setting this kind of a layout up, I'd check back in with it every time I discover something different about my preferences. So just listing out different triggers or content warnings that I either want to avoid or I've found that I'm okay with. Another reference that can be very useful, especially if you're the type of person who likes to print out little book covers for your reading journal, is a sizing guide or a sizing reference. In this one, I would list out the different instances where I print book covers, so the different contexts that I'm using them in, and then specify what print size I want and also what actual size it ends up. For instance, just because I set my printer to print a, 6 cm by 4 cm box, sometimes it's a little closer to a 5.5 and a 3.5. Having that reference in your journal can be very useful, especially because if you go by what it actually prints out as, you might size it too big or too small on your computer. You could also do a similar thing for page sizings and different structures that you're using in your reading journal so that you have a quick reference of how to set those up too. If you're the kind of person who really likes statistics in your reading journal, then having a list of the things that you want to keep track of could be helpful as well. I've broken this one down so that you have overall statistics, yearly statistics, and monthly statistics, just so that you remember to put those different sections on your various pages as you set your journal up. This one again could be set up as a kind of checklist, so overall you'd probably only need to put 1 checkbox. Yearly, probably also 1 depending on how long you're keeping your reading journal, and then monthly you would have checkboxes for each of the months that are going to be captured in here. While I've set this reference up on an actual page, what I'd probably be inclined to do would be have a little flip out to the side of the journal, especially for those monthly statistics, just so that I had it there as a handy reference when I came to set up those monthly pages. It's good to note that all of the pages we're looking at here have been made in what I call my R&D journal, or research and development. This isn't my actual reading journal, I've just just made these layouts in here so you can kind of see a suggested or an idea of a structure. Our next reference material though is a list of things that you can do to read more. What kind of tactics and strategies can you use to make reading more of a habit for you? I consider this one to be a reference more than a checklist. You're not necessarily just going to do each of these things once. It's more so that when you're in a reading slump or you're feeling like your reading isn't really at the level you'd want it to be, you can come back to this list and consider how you could remedy that. Another reference list that I really like the idea of is setting up a space that outlines a recipe for a reading day. So what kind of materials and steps are you going to take in order to make a cozy reading day kind of a little retreat from the world, just get in and read your books. While I've just done this one as a step-by-step list and then a list of materials, what would be really fun would be to draw or print off little pictures related to each of the things, kind of make it a reading day collage almost. I think that would look really cute. Another handy reference that might be useful to have at the start of your reading journal is a reading playlist page, in particular with little QR codes so that you can just scan the QR code on your phone and it'll take you directly to that playlist. These little QR codes can be made online. You just Google search QR code generator, there are plenty of free ones, and then you just make your playlist in YouTube or on Spotify, anything that has a URL that you can directly link to. This is a reference that I would probably want to have at the very start of my journal so it was very easily accessible, and I'd probably have different playlists for different kind of moods in terms of my reading. So maybe one for my fantasy reads, maybe one for my kind of cozy vibes, and then another one for like spooky or scary reads to kind of set the mood. Another reference list that could be very useful to have would be something like a reading review questions list. Especially if you find that when you go to do your reading reviews, you don't want to have to try and reinvent the wheel every time with what you're going to be reflecting on. Having a list of questions that are kind of your go-to, your stock standard ones, the ones that can be applied to a fairly wide range of the things that you like to read, that could make for a really good reference page. I just took this list from somewhere online, literally Google searched reading review prompts, sized it to fit into the journal, printed it out, and stuck it in. As said at the start, I used a lot of different sources for inspiration in terms of these layouts, and I've tried to list them or link them in the description box, along with any of the materials that I used to set all of these up. On to our next section though, this one is all about TBRs, or your list of things that are to be read. The first idea we have is very simply just a TBR, so writing out a list of all of the books you want to read, and then having a space to check them off once you've read them. You could combine this with a little kind of rating section down the side, so as you read the book you can put in what rating you gave it, but I've kept this one fairly simple, just a regular list view. Of course, the structure I'm using here is just a suggestion. You could also print out the little covers and do things like that, but flipping over, the next style of TBR we have is a TBR by type. So this is taking all of those books that you want to read, but then specifying what format you want to read them in. Do you want it to be a physical book, audiobook, ebook? You could also have another section that says, I don't really care what type, I just want to read it. Or maybe even another that's more for like immersion reads, where you're reading the text at the same time as listening to the audio. These little pictures are stamps, along with these ones down here, but this idea is a TBR by genre. So thinking about the different genres that you like to read, what kind of books do you want to read in those genres? Another way that you can do your TBR though is more of a lucky dip. For this one, I've just made a little envelope or kind of pocket in the journal. This one's actually just a brown paper bag that I stuck in. And then inside of this, you write out all of the books you want to read on different pieces of paper, and then you just slot them in there so that you can pull one out when it comes to selecting your next book. This also could be another opportunity to print off the book covers, because you just slip the book covers into the pocket, pull them out, and then once you've read it, you can stick it in your journal to write your review. Just make sure that if you're using a particularly deep pocket, it's easy to get any of the books that slip to the bottom. But flipping on over, and our next idea is a series tracker. I've included this one in the TBR section because oftentimes if you start a series, provided you liked the first book enough, you probably want to continue. But the way this one works is that we list out the title of the series down the side, and then on the right hand side we have dots to indicate each of the books in that series. This one builds from right to left, so you can see it goes from 1 on the very right to 13 or whatever number you want to go up to. Mainly so that if extra books get added to the series, you don't run out of room, or at least you have all of the room available to you up until the point where you've written in the series title. As you read each of the books in the series though, you just check them off using those dots that you've got there. This is only one way to do a series tracker. You could just write out the name of the series title and then list out all the books underneath this, also totally valid. But another style of TBR that you might want want to have is a read their catalog list. So this is taking one author or one series in particular, especially a very large series, and writing out everything in that series or everything by that author and trying to get through as much of it as possible. If you know what the series I've listed here is, then let me know in the comments. But our next idea is putting in a reading order page, especially for series that have things like prequels or those kind of like partway between two books kind of entries. Listing the books out in the order that you want to read them could be quite useful, especially if you're particularly new to the series and you don't necessarily know what comes after what. But flipping over, and our next idea are bookshelves. This one in particular was kind of playing along the idea that you've got on Goodreads, where you can make your own little shelves and put books into effectively different lists. You can do a similar thing with your TBR in your journal. For each of these shelves, I've just listed what they are on the shelf itself, and then you can draw out some little book shapes and then write the titles in if you want to, use a color code that relates to an actual list. It's really just another way to visualize your TBR. Now, if your TBR starts to get quite long, you might want to have a reading my backlist page. I've drawn this one out so that you section off 3 books to read in each month of the year, just to kind of cut down on that backlist, especially the ones that have been there for quite a while, you've been meaning to read them for ages, and you really want to dedicate the time to do it in the coming year. I'm getting to a point where I feel like I need one of those. But another style of TBR is a book to screen log. In this one, you write out all of the books that you want to read, but in particular the ones that have some kind of other media associated with them, some audio-visual type thing, so whether that be a movie or a TV show or a game, just as a way to kind of further immerse yourself in that world. I've set this one up so that we have a column for each of the different types of media, so books, movies, TV shows, games, and then also a column to check off when you've completed everything for that book or series. Another style of TBR, which might be a little bit more niche, is an ARCs log, so ARC being advanced reader copy. If you're not the kind of person who reads advanced reader copies, or you don't get offered them or apply for them, then probably don't need this one. But if you are the kind of person who gets them and reads them, then something like this could be useful. In this one, we have 5 little dots to represent different stages of the ARC process. Very much depends on whose ARCs you're reading, what kind of process you have for yourself. But I put in applied, accepted, read, feedback, and review. As you do each of those, you just draw the little symbol into the dot underneath the space for the book. Now, the way that I mainly use my TBR list is to figure out what I want to read next, so you might want to have a what to read next flowchart in your journal. The way you actually set this one up is very much dependent on how you like to read, what you like to read, all of that kind of thing. But effectively, we start at the top, ask ourselves a series of questions to get to a suggestion of what to read next. I've done this one mainly based on genres, so reading a romance, reading a mystery, reading a horror book, but there are also a couple of other things in there as well. Actually, planning out a layout like this can be a little bit tricky, so I would recommend doing it on a scrap piece of paper or in pencil first. Also, to make it just a little bit more user-friendly, I color-coded the boxes so that then anything in green is kind of like an end of the line, this is your recommendation, and anything in purple was a response to a question that was in white. So for instance, do you want a leisure or a learning read? And then leisure is on one side in purple, learning is on the other in purple, so on and so forth. On to the next page, and something like a reading prompts list could be another useful way to figure out what to read next. I set this one up so that you would roll a d20 die and then figure out the prompt based on the result of that roll. It really depends on how many prompts you want to write down for yourself and whether you have a d20 die, though I suppose there are generators online for that. I do also like the idea of tying the prompt to the number. So for instance, 5 is a 5-star prediction. 3 is a book that's part of a trilogy. That kind of thing. Another way to decide what to read next would be something like a non-fiction topics to explore list. This is where you write out the different things that you want to learn about or explore, investigate, and then beside this you write out the reads that you're going to use to do that. This is another one that could be set up as a checklist, so as you read them, you check them off. But our next section of layout ideas are all related to purchasing. The first one is a books bought log, so writing out for each month of the year what books did you buy and also how much did you spend on them. Depending on your buying habits, you might need a little bit more space than this, or possibly less. So tweak the layout to fit your book buying habits. As you buy or acquire books, it might also be useful to have a list of what you actually own. You could section this into two, so things that you've read and own versus not read and own, but then as you read them, you'd either have to move them over to the other list or check them off. I would probably consider the read versus not read lists to be more of a static snapshot of your owned books, but you could also set this one up as just a one column list and put a little check mark to say that you've read it once you have. Another layout that might be good to have as related to book buying is something like a book wish list. This is another one that you could again section out depending on the type of media. So is it a physical book, ebook, audiobook? You could also section it out by genre. You could section it out by extent of wanting, like how much do you wish you had this book? And depending on how you use your wish list, it could be a wish list in terms of books for other people to buy me versus books for me to buy myself. I've put our next idea in the buying category because I feel like it's most related to that, but you could also have a list of books you're unhauling. These are the ones that you're getting rid of either by donating, gifting, selling them. Or possibly, if the book really has reached the end of its life, then maybe you're recycling it. Though I would probably be inclined to turn such a book into crafting materials, use it in your reading journal for decoration. But on this one, we just have the stack of books. You could write out the titles for each of the different books, use a color code to indicate how you got rid of that book, and then if you wanted to keep track of it, you could also keep a running total of how much you've added back into your book fund. Our next idea is another that isn't necessarily about purchasing books, but this one is a how much did the library save me log. In this one, you'd write out the title of all of the books that you borrowed from the library, and then write out how much that book would have been if you had to purchase it yourself. At the end of the month or year, period, whatever else, you just total up how much it was that you didn't end up spending because you went to the library and got those books instead. The next idea we have for our book buyers though is a list of the places that you enjoy buying your books from. This could be small businesses that you're trying to support, it could be specific locations for specific types of books. For instance, if you have a particular space that you like to go for graphic novels and manga versus other spaces that you buy ebooks, audiobooks, anything like that. You could also keep this with a list of how much you spent at each of those places if you want to keep track of that kind of a statistic, or you can just have it there as a reference list for yourself. This next one, again, I've put in the book buying category. I should probably call it like book acquiring, but anyway, this one is a list of your gifted reads. In this one, you just list out who got you the book and also the book's title, maybe having a space to record when you read the book. You could also have a space to record the type of book, so P for physical, E for ebook, and A for audiobook. There are a lot of different pieces of information you could include on there. You could also have things like, was it on my wish list? Was it for a birthday or just because? What did you end up rating the book? All of that kind of information could go on this list if you wanted to. Flipping over though and getting into our next category, this one is all related to things you've actually read. The first page idea in this one is a books read master list. So this is just keeping track of all of your reads. Effectively, a book does not get added to such a list until you've actually finished it. And in this kind of a list, I'd keep track of information like the date that I finished it, what title the book had, and also my rating of the book as well. You could keep track of this one just for a set period of time. So it could be for a year or a month, quarter, whatever else. Or it could just be a running list that you just keep adding to year upon year upon year. Very much depends on how you like to set up your reading journals. The next idea we have though is a bookshelfie, and it's effectively just a bookshelf that you populate with books that you've read. I like to have mine with spaces that are big enough that I can write the book titles in. This one is a printable that's available in my little shop. That one's linked in the description box below. This one has 25 books on it, so very good for something like a 25 books to read in 1 year kind of layout. But we also have options with 52 books, 50 books, 100 books. just depending on how much you like to read. Another layout idea that you might want to include based on the books that you've read is a list of authors that you've read books from. For this one, I just took a collection of different authors and printed off their pictures. And of the 18 that we have on this page, I'd love to know how many of them you actually recognize. But just because you've read an author doesn't mean that you love them. So another layout idea could be just your authors that are your favorites, the ones that you very much enjoyed their books, you think they're absolute gems, so you wanted them to have a special place in your journal. This could also be combined with something like the author backlist and trying to read all of their books, But flipping over, a layout that I love seeing in people's journals are the ones where they just print off all of the covers of their reads. We do have a separate video on the channel that describes how you can print off little book covers for your reading journal. That one, like everything, is linked in the description box. And you don't have to print them off as small as I've done here. I just wanted it to fit into this top section of the page because even though I've set up like 100 different ideas in this video, I didn't want it to take up 100 pages in my research and development journal. A similar idea though is rather than having the covers of every single read you had, regardless of how much you enjoyed it, is having a layout that's just dedicated to your favorites. On these you can add quotes, notes, thoughts, doodles, whatever else. Or you could just keep it to the covers themselves, or even just a running list of those titles. While this section is dedicated to books you've read, sometimes there are going to be books that we don't finish. And I do like to have a space in my journal dedicated to what those were, mainly because they won't get captured in a layout like covers of my reads or a books read master list, because I specifically didn't finish those books. In this one, I just write down the date that I decided to not continue with the book and the title of the book. But getting into our next section, the first idea we have here is book notes. This is more specifically for non-fiction rather than fiction. It's effectively taking down little notes about your learnings, that kind of stuff as you read your book. You could technically do it for fiction as well, but more commonly we see it done for non-fiction. If you wanted to section spaces out on a book notes kind of layout, you could have ones that were just kind of like general thoughts and feelings, takeaway points, action steps, those kind of sections. But the next layout type that you might want to put in your journal is a dedicated book review space. In terms of the structure we have here, we've got the book cover, little rating, some other information about the book in terms of like author, pages, genre, and then you could effectively just brain dump all of your thoughts about the book, or you could make it a little bit more structured with some targeting questions. Depending on how much you want to write about the book, you might just want to make this a kind of half page, or possibly a full page, or I have seen people do a full spread for a book review. I never like to write quite that much, to the extent where all of the text in here is not actually my handwriting, it's just a washi tape. Mainly because these pages are just ideas and I didn't want to give myself a hand cramp having to write all of the little blurbs in. Another type of review you can have though is a series review. I haven't given myself a lot of space to write in here, which I mean we just said I didn't actually write in here, but this would probably be the kind of thing that I would do an entire page for, especially if you want to print out all the covers for the series and it's like a longer series. Having enough space to actually get your thoughts out, probably a good idea. Looking at another type of review though, especially for those reads that are in a dual format, so maybe a movie and a book, or a TV show and the book. You could review the two pieces of media together, so having half of the page dedicated to the book and half of the page dedicated to the other media type. It's also interesting to see if your rating across the two changes at all. Flipping over though, our next idea is having a space for your read ratings, so a place to note down what you rated each of the books you read. You could do this one as a simple list, kind of like the book master list we had before, or I thought this idea was a lot of fun. You effectively have little cards that you can write your book titles on, kind of like the spine of a book, or you could print off the book covers, and then you set yourself up a little read rating trolley. This one's done so each of the trolley bases is actually a separate piece of paper, so you can slip the books in and move them if your rating changes. Once you're kind of set on what the rating of the book is going to be, you could just add a little bit of double-sided tape and stick them in. But I thought this one was really cute for being able to reposition things, fit a whole bunch of reads in, especially if you want to use this one over a longer period of time. And the structure of this layout in particular was inspired by Savannah Scribbles. As said, I have used a variety of sources of inspiration when making these layouts, and while I can't remember all of them, that one I did remember. Another layout idea though is having a space to jot down the words that you've learned. Especially if, like me, you're not as widely read as some people. You come across a lot of words that you didn't know previously, you might have to go look them up, and it can be good to jot those learnings down. In this example, you just write out the word, you'd write out what type of word it is, so is it like a noun, an adjective, an adverb. You might also want to have a pronunciation note for yourself, and then underneath this write out what the definition is and possibly include an example. Or you could include the example from where you first saw it. Another layout idea for the books that you've read is having a space to jot down the quotes that hit. The ones that kind of like hit you in the feels, really got you thinking, very much captured the way that you feel about something, anything like that. You could have them as kind of like a quotes log, so having a lot of quotes together, or it could just be a quote page dedicated to one quote in particular that really stood out. The idea we have down the bottom here though is book-related journaling, and this one is more specifically related to non-fiction ideas again. For this one I was in particular thinking about the Daily Stoic, because it's a book that's intentionally set up so it gives you something to reflect on or think about for every day. Having a space to jot those thoughts down could be something you want to put in your reading journal. Now, if you like the idea of reviewing your reads, but you don't really like the idea of writing too much, then something like a one-sentence review space could be useful. In this one, you just write out the title and author of the book, and then underneath this write out one sentence or one line about how you felt. It can be kind of challenging to capture all of your thoughts in just one sentence, so you could expand this to 2 or 3 if you need to, but the entire point is to keep this very short, snappy, concise. Going for the opposite of concise though, you might want to put plot summaries in your journal too, especially if there are particular plots that you're really intrigued by, you loved the structure of, you thought they were really captivating, you might want to jot those down. Or if it's part of a series where you know the next book that's coming out is a little while away and you just want to capture the main points so that when that book comes out you have this to rely on to kind of re-jog your memory so that you know what happened previously. You could write this one out yourself, or you could just find a summary online, print it out and stick it in. Another log that could be a little bit of fun could be one related to plot twists, in particular thinking about the good and the not so good. Maybe the ones that you didn't see coming, the ones that felt really satisfying, versus the ones that were either kind of dumb or really obvious, just didn't really hit the way that you possibly hoped they would. Our next section of ideas I'm calling me, a reader, because it's all about how you prefer to read, your reading preferences. The first idea we have being a reading likes and dislikes list. Now you could just do this one as literally a list, so one half and the other for the likes versus dislikes, or I've sectioned it out so it goes like, dislike, dislike. Kind of depends on how many entries you're going to have in here, but there might be particular tropes that you do or don't like, plot devices, characters, anything else. You can write those ones down for yourself, kind of as a snapshot of you as a reader, or so that you can kind of seek out reads that fit in with those likes and dislikes. Another layout you can have related to personal preferences could be characters that you love or characters that you relate to. I just found some fan art of some characters I'm familiar with and stuck those ones in. And a very related list is that of book boyfriends. This one in particular is inspired by my friend Rachel. She sometimes makes little Instagram stories related to like, this is the book, this is the boyfriend. So I've just tucked that one down the bottom here as a simple list where you write out the title of the book and the boyfriend in the book. This might be another fun one to include some fan art though, just so you can kind of visualize what the boyfriends look like. The next one though is another one that's related to you as a reader. So I've titled it as my reading habits, but you could just think about it as a series of questions that you answer at a snapshot in time of you and your reading preferences. So what are your favorite genres? Who are your favorite authors? What are your book buying habits? How many things do you have on your TBR? What kind of rating system do you use? Could be quite interesting to keep track of, possibly even set it up as a then and again layout, essentially where you put the prompts down the middle of the page, then answer them on one side at the start of your reading journal, and then the other side at the end. It can just be a bit of fun to see how those things change across a span of time. Our next section is all about the social aspect of reading though, with our first idea being a place to honour your book clubs. I've picked 2 in particular, so BBBC, the Bujo Buddies Book Club, which is the one hosted by myself, Monica, and Rachel. That one's free to join, you can find information in the description box. And we have the other book club that I'm part of that I actually haven't read a book from yet, but that is the Page Mages. You of course can list out more information than just a picture of each of the book clubs though, so that's where something like a book club info page could be useful. On this one you can have things like what's the book club name, how many books do they read in the year, when are their meeting days, meeting times. You might also like to have information about the members of the book club, any kind of information that's relevant to that book club in particular, maybe if they only read specific genres, specific types of books, anything like that. And a layout that I really enjoy keeping in my reading journal is a list of the book club reads, or more so a log that has all of the pictures of their covers. Our book club does a book per month, so 12 on this one. If you space this a little differently, you could also put the rating for each of the books under there, or just leave it to the pictures. If your book club has meetings, then it could be good to have a space dedicated to those in your journal as well. I've done this one in 3 separate sections, so notes for before the book club meeting, notes for after or during the meeting, and then also a little meeting agenda, just so you know the different things that are going to be discussed, either as a member or as a host. Stepping away from book clubs, but still sticking with the social aspect of reading, you could also have a layout dedicated to your buddy reads. These are the ones that you intentionally schedule to read with somebody else around the same time, just so that you can both immerse yourselves in the world, discuss with each other in terms of what you're finding out about the characters, the setting, the author, anything you want to talk about really. I normally set this one up very simply, just to say what is the title and who am I reading it with. This structure is mainly so that you can list out different groups of buddies each time, but if you have a dedicated core group that you like to read with time and time again, you might want to set up a dedicated layout just for buddy reading with those people. Another socially related layout is having a recommendations list, in particular recommendations from other people. You could set this one up so it's recommendations from one person in particular, or a recommendations list from any people. In this style of layout, I would list out who the recommendation was from, what's the title and author of the book, and I'd also have a space to rate the book, just so that then I can kind of keep tabs on whether the recommendations I'm getting from certain people actually fit with the books that I like to read, mainly because if I'm getting a lot of recommendations from someone and I'm not really enjoying those books, then possibly I don't want to have as many recs from them on my TBR. No shade, maybe it's just not for me. Another place that we can get recommendations though is from social media, thus putting it in the social category. So I'm calling this layout idea an as seen on list. So it could be as seen on BookTok, or BookTube, or Bookstagram, wherever else. In this one, I'd write down what the recommendation was in terms of title, maybe author, and also have an indication as to where I got the rec from, in this case just using a little icon to represent the different social media platforms. Continuing with the social media idea, you could also have a list of your favorite reader creators. These could be the people that you trust the opinion of in terms of giving reading recommendations. They could be your inspiration sources for your reading journal. If you have a favorite creator that you want to shout out, let me know in the comments because I would be keen to check them out. But I've just listed out a couple here that are either in our community or recommended by our community. Moving into the reading journal layouts that you'd set up on a yearly basis, one of these could just be your reading related goals for the year. I've set this one up so that we just have a little box for each of those goals. There's a lot of flexibility with how you set up a goals list. It could just be a list, it could be a little bit more decorated, it could have an actual dedicated plan attached to it depending on how serious you are about the goal. I find that for my reading goals I usually just do put them on a list on a page that's a little bit decorated so it looks nice. They're not usually the kind of goals that I'm actively working on day by day, week by week, that kind of thing, so a full fleshed out action plan usually isn't necessary. Another type of yearly page you might want to set up is what we're calling XX books in 20XX. So this would be like 25 books in 2025, 26 in 2026. So on and so forth. In this one, we're again just using that printable from my shop, so this one having 25 books for each of the books that would be read in 2025 in theory. You don't have to have the same number as the year, especially if you like to read a lot more or a lot less. If you are the kind of person who reads a lot more than the last 2 digits from the year number, then maybe you want to pick out specific books that you want to get to in the year. Set yourself a list of 25, 26, however many books, and just set yourself the challenge of making sure that they do get read across the year. In this one though, you can color code the books based on their rating, you can write down when you started and finished your reading challenge, but flipping on over, and another yearly page you might want to set up is something like a year in pixels. Now, the way that you use a year in pixels, very, very flexible, a lot of different options. I've set this one up based on days you did read versus days you didn't. Any days that this hypothetical person has read get a little purple dot, and any of the ones where they were reading and they finished a book also get a little black dot as well. Now, hopefully as we've been going through the video, you've been noting down ideas of the layouts that you want to use at some point. Just be aware that this type of layout is only for particular people, and it is okay if it is not for you. It can sometimes be kind of hard to keep track of whether you read on any given day of the year, and keeping up with a tracker like this can be kind of tricky. I know personally I wouldn't use this in my reading journal, but I'm not the kind of person who would keep up with this kind of thing. My friend Monica though, she has a layout like this that she does keep track of, and it's very cool to see the data at the end of the year, so proceed with caution. I mean, the same could be said for pretty much any of these layouts. Give yourself the flexibility to try something new, have a little bit of fun with it, but it's okay if every layout doesn't get 100% used. Another layout that could be good for a yearly setup though is something like an anticipated releases log. In this one, you'd write down any of the books that are coming up and the ones in particular you're excited for, and write out what date they're coming out. Then once you acquire the book, you can check them off, You might also want to have a space to check off when you've read the book, a space to rate the book, anything like that. This one though, I just wanted to tuck into the space next to the year in pixels. Another style of layout that is very similar to that one is an annual release calendar. So this one's kind of set up like a future log from a bullet journal, having a space for each of the months of the year, and you can write out what day of what month any of your books are getting released on. This one can also be used for reading challenges and noting down what months those are happening in. So our next idea is a reading challenge calendar. This one I've set up so it only lists out one reading challenge per month. The one run by my book club is the Google Readathon, which happens in May. But there are plenty of readathons that happen in any given month, and some that go across the whole year. That could also be an annual layout you set up, dedicated to those yearly reading challenges. But another style of layout is something like an annual reading tracker. Now this one is very similar to the year in pixels, just set up a little bit differently. And again, for each day that you read across the year, for the relevant day, you just put a little dot over the top to say that you read. Any days that you didn't, you skip, or you could use a different color if you wanted to. Again, it's just another visual way to show how much reading you've done across the year. The one that I've set up here technically is 1 day short of the entire year. I figured I'd just give myself the day off on December 31st, but it's just another way to visualize how much reading you've been doing. The layout where we have up here though is a full year reading list. So we have a column for each of the months of the year, just using the initial for each of them. And then down the right hand side we have the titles of the books read. As you finish each of these books though, you just write in the day number underneath the relevant column. So for instance, Queen of Shadows, that one has a 14 underneath the first J, so that's saying that on the 14th of January, Queen of Shadows was finished. For Inkblood Sister Scribe, that one's got a 27 underneath the J, or underneath January. So on the 27th of January, that's when that book was finished. Stepping into the monthly related pages though, something like a monthly TBR could be fun to set up. This one I've just done as a little stack of books, so you draw out the stack, write in the book titles. This could also be something that you set up at the end of the month to say which books you did read, rather than ones you wanted to read. And you could do some color coding on here based on rating, or formats, anything like that. Just another way to represent the books you've been reading. Flipping over, and one that we see from a lot of people, which I think is cool, but I don't need to use because it's just not how I like to keep track of my books, but that's something like a reading calendar. In this one, you use a colored line to indicate the days of which you were using to read any particular book. So for instance, this first purple line we have, which goes from the 1st to the 4th, that would be one particular book that you read across those days. On the 4th, you finished that one, and you got started with whatever this green book was, and that one took you 3 days to read. While some people like to actually write on top of those coloured stripes what the book titles were, I've just got a little space at the bottom to indicate what they are. So just using the colour code from the calendar, noting in the days from, to, and then writing in the title. In this little bit of blank space here, I've just indicated that there were 9 reads for the month. All of the little bits and pieces that I've used for decoration, like the washi tape, the PET tape, those are linked in the description box. Another monthly related page though that you might want to set up is something related to a monthly reading challenge. Now there are plenty of ones that put out online, like the ones that we had in that little kind of reading challenge calendar from before, and some of these will have printables that you can just stick into your journal, which is really handy. Other ones you might have to make yourself, or even if they do have a printable, you might still want to make them yourself. For instance, I have this one that I made for Deck of TBR-a-thon. It did have a printable, but my entire reading journal is in like browns and beiges outside of the covers of the books, so I decided to make it for myself. Depending on the reading challenge, the structure of this one is going to change. So this one is just an example from the Magical Readathon. But flipping on over, and our next idea is a month in review layout. The information you capture on here, again, very much up to you. This layout was inspired by Monica, my friend, bibliophile by night. So we've got a space to list out the books that were read, the ones that were bought, where you bought them from, a couple of covers highlighted for favorite and least favorite read, longest and shortest, first bought, last bought, a couple of spaces for some graphs depending on the format, the genre, rating, sources like where you bought the books from, and a space to list out any books that were unhauled. I'm kind of tempted to start using these in my reading journal. I haven't done a lot of monthly pages previously, outside of like monthly reading challenges, but I do love the way these stats pages end up looking. The next section we're looking at though are reading challenges, and these are the ones that are kind of common in the community. They're not the ones that are set up by a particular creator or anything like that, but more so some of the stock standard kind of generic ones, mainly because if we also took into account every single challenge made by every bookish creator, we would be here for quite a bit longer. But our first idea though is a reading bingo board. In this one, you just set up a board of any size, I've done a 5x5, and then populate each of the sections with a different prompt for your reading. As you complete a read related to one of these, you can just color the box in. You can also keep a list next to this so that you can say like, oh, the book that made me ugly cry was, the book that was overhyped was. I've done this one in my reading journal as a little flip up, so I can just write down the title of the book underneath here. So the book that made me ugly cry was Kingdom of Ash. This bingo board is available as a free printable from our resource library, which is also linked in the description box, funnily enough. Another challenge you might want to undertake though is the Goodreads challenge. This is where you just set yourself a particular number of books that you want to read across the year, and you can also put a little tracker for this in your reading journal. I've just got a little box to represent each of the books. As you read them, you colour them in. Another common but kind of difficult reading challenge is the A to Z challenge. This one can either be done in terms of the title of the book, or it could be in terms of the author, either first name or last name. In this one though, you're just trying to find a read that relates to every single letter of the alphabet. I know that for some of the letters, like X and Z, people sometimes just take it as if the title contains the letter at all, they will include it for that letter, rather than starts with X, starts with Z. I've just listed out some examples, just to kind of show you how you would fill this one in as time progresses and you get your reads done. Another challenge we have though is the 52 in 52, so 52 books in 52 weeks. This is another bookshelf printable, available in the little shop, and as you read each of these books, you could just color it in, you could possibly write the title of the book along the spine if you're writing kind of small. I do love a tracker with a visual representation like this. Kind of tempted to make my goal for next year 52. This year my goal was only 24 and I managed to hit it around the mid-year point, so I think I might be able to do 52. But another challenge you could do is a trope challenge. So this is taking a bunch of tropes for the genre that you like to read in particular, or genres, and trying to find a read related to each of those. I've set this one up again as a bingo board, just because, again, I like that kind of visual representation. And as you read a book that has one of these tropes, you just colour the box in. Another fun challenge is a reading throughout the ages challenge. So this is just taking different decades and trying to find a read that relates to each of them. Which decades you look at is completely up to you. You might also want to have decades that are in the future, kind of like, a lot of sci-fi novels, or ones that are kind of timeless, or ones where the time period is kind of hard to predict, like I feel a lot of fantasy reads fit into. This could also make for a really fun tracker, where you're tracking how many of your books are within each of the different time frames, or when each of your books were published. That could also be an interesting tracker. See if you're reading books that were more recently published, or ones that were published a couple years ago, a couple decades ago, and anything outside of that and in between. Another type of challenge that is kind of commonly seen is a reading Monopoly board. You can design one yourself. For each of the typical Monopoly board places have a different prompt for your reading, or I just printed this board off as an example from a reading challenge that's based on Monopoly. If I were to do this in my journal, I would probably make the board bigger, spanning a full spread, just because this is a little bit tight, can be a little bit hard to read some of the prompts. And you could also set it up so that the typical community chest has like another list of prompts that you use. Maybe something special happens if you land on free parking or something like that. But our next reading challenge is a Read the Rainbow challenge. This is where you try and find a read that has a cover the colour of each colour of the rainbow. So red, orange, yellow, so on and so forth. You could also include black, white and brown in here if you wanted to. I just stuck these ones in as examples. Another common challenge though is an Around the World challenge. So for this one you just find a little map outline online, in particular one that has the country borders, because the idea is trying to read a book that's either set in as many countries as you can find, or the author is born in or based in as many of the countries as you can find. Can be a little bit tricky, and there are certainly a lot of countries, so very, very tricky, but if you like a challenge, this one could be for you. Our next section though is all related to stats and tracking, with our first idea being read more XYZ. Now this one is XYZ because the categories are very much up to you, but effectively if there are particular types of books or genres of books that you're trying to read more of, you're just keeping track of how many of them you're reading on a monthly basis. So how many manga, how many graphic novels, how many horrors or mysteries or thrillers or whatever else. As said, the categories are up to you. By keeping track of how many of those reads you're doing month to month, you can kind of see if you're on the right track as it relates to that goal. Another type of reading tracker is something like a reading Kanban board. So this one has 4 columns: to read, reading, to review, and finished. For each of your reads, you just write out their title on a little post-it note, sticking it in the to read column, and then as you start reading it, you move it over. Once your reading is done, you move it to review, and then when you're completely finished with it, you put it in the finished space. If I were using this layout, I would probably set it up so it spans a lot more space than just the little corner it's tucked into here, unless you can either write quite small and find little post-it notes. Seems kind of messy though, I'd probably just make it bigger. If you like the idea of keeping track of the kind of sequential nature of reading, but don't really want to set it up like a Kanban board, you could do something similar to this type of layout, where instead of having a month for each of the columns, just have a different stage of the reading process and check them off as you go along. The next idea we have though is my reading mediums. So thinking about across each of the months or however long you're doing this for, what book types are you enjoying? Physical, audio, ebook? Are they immersion reads where you do like ebook and audio together, or physical book and audio together? You can also keep track of other categories, kind of similar to the read more XYZ list, and the layouts of these two are kind of interchangeable. You could do it more table-based or individual stripe-based, more writing in this one though. It does look pretty cute though. Now there was no way that I was gonna be able to get away with doing a reading journal ideas video without including the book bracket. If you can't already tell from the sound of my voice, I don't really like the book bracket. I think the layout looks cool, but the idea of it kind of irks me. More on that in a second, but the general idea here is that for the top reads from each of the months across the year, you put them head to head in this kind of like bracket, I don't know, Thunderdome type structure, where we start with 6 pairs, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Each of them fight against one another, so like Fourth Wing going up against Queen of Shadows, or Make Time going up against Heartstopper Volume 4, and then whichever book is better by your standards moves on to the next round. We then have those books compete against each other, so on this side we have The Power of Moments, Make Time, and Bride competing against each other, and then whichever is the winner from those 3 moves on to the finals. From the finals, we then have those 2 go together to crown the overall winner for the year. Which book was the best? Now the reason that I don't like this layout is that it really is only good for picking your top book, your top 1 book. And it feels like a lot of work to pick just the top 1. The reason I say that it is only the top 1 is because at either this stage or this stage, your second option could have gotten knocked out. Like, just because Make Time got to second place technically doesn't actually mean it's the second best book. What if the second best book was actually A Court of Wings and Ruin, but because it versed A Court of Mist and Fury first, it got knocked out in round 1? But anyway, in terms of the structure, love the structure. You can also write a little bit of extra information or do some journaling, put in some decoration because there's this blank space here. But when it comes to rating reads, my personal preference is a ranking matrix. Now I know this looks complicated, I promise you it actually isn't, but instead of just pitting books against each other in this kind of format where it's these 2 verse, only this one moves on, the way that the ranking matrix works is that every single book gets to go up against every single book. All we have to do is list out all of the contenders along the side here, so each of them is assigned a letter, and then each of the letters goes head to head. Whoever wins, that's the one that we write in the white box. A versus B, A1. A versus C, C1. B versus C, C1, so on and so forth. As you do these little head-to-head battles, then the winners get written in the white space here, and then you just count up how many of each letter you had. Whoever had the most, that's the top book of the year. So you can see, yes, A Court of Mist and Fury still came out on top, but second place did not go to Make Time. Make Time was in third. Fourth Wing came in second place. But because of how things shook out in this space, because A Court of Mist and Fury and Fourth Wing were on the same side of the bracket, meant that Fourth Wing got knocked out early. Hopefully you can kind of see what my gripe with this layout is. It looks cool, but I just don't like that you don't get anything beyond just the top place. You don't really have a good appreciation of second place, third place. This gives you that. But moving on, our next layout idea is a space to dedicate to your pages read or minutes listened to, depending on if you do ebooks, audiobooks, physical books, any kind of combination. This one I've set up so that it is monthly tracking, so the days of the month down the side, and then along the top here we have numbers to represent how many pages you read or how many minutes were listened to. The actual scale you go with here really depends on how much you typically read in a day, but then we just have a bar of colour to indicate how much reading was done on each of these days. It can kind of just be interesting to see how your reading changes across the month. So are there particular days of the week where you're less inclined to read? Do you find that come the mid-month point you have a big reading slump? Just gives you a little bit more information about your reading patterns. Can also help you figure out roughly how long you need to give yourself to read a book based on how many pages that book has or how many minutes in the audiobook. Flipping over, another type of tracker that you could have is a diversity reads tracker, especially if you're trying to read quite widely or outside of your typical reading genres, reading styles, author types, anything like that. This one I've just set up as a little graph where each of the bars on the graph is done as a little book. So we have the categories along the bottom, completely up to you what they are, and then up the side we have the number of reads in each of those. This would be the kind of stats page that you set up at the end of the month or quarter or year, or at the end of your journal if you don't want to have like a regular unit of time. Another thing we can keep track of is our ratings across each of the months, and I've set this one up so that this is a percentage-based tracker. Yes, it does require a little bit of math, but it also means that the statistics you have from month to month are a little bit more comparable with each other, especially if you don't necessarily read the same number of books each month. In this one I've set up a little color code, so how many or like what percentage of the books were each of the ratings, and then across the year you can start to see which of the months was the best in terms of your ratings, and which one did you have the highest percentage of high ratings for your books. Another style of stats and tracking page that could be a lot of fun is something like a reading wrapped. So this is kind of like a take on the wrapped that you get through Spotify at the end of the year, and it can be a little bit hard to find these statistics without something like Goodreads or Storygraph or something like that. But depending on the information you want to capture in here, it could just be from your own understanding of yourself as a reader. I've done things like top genres, your top reads, and you can just write out their titles, the top authors that you read from, so like who did you read the most from, and then also just other stats that you want to keep track of, like how many authors did you read that were new to you? How many subgenres did you explore? What decade were the majority of your reads published in? I love these styles of layouts because they're just really kind of like fun memory keeping pages along with having the statistics. But our next section of page layouts are what I'm calling just for fun, the first of which is a book awards space. So this isn't so much actual awards that books have won, but more so setting out some categories for yourself, so at the end of the year or the end of your reading journal, you can dedicate one of these little awards to one of the books that you read. This could be things like most relatable character, worst book, a book that had great ideas but it was poorly executed. I think these are a lot of fun, and they are very much dictated by personal choice, by what you've read, rather than like People's Choice Awards or anything like that. Another just for fun layout is something like a reading retreat planning space. Reading retreats are the name that I give to a day that you've just dedicated to reading, though they could also be like an actual reading retreat where you go away somewhere to do reading, book yourself a cabin in the woods, hopefully not a spooky one, to get all of your reading done. But on this kind of a planning page, I'd have some details about the reading retreat, like when, where, have a to-do list of things that you need to do in preparation for it. I find that for the reading retreats that we do, we usually have some kind of a snack plan with a snack theme or something like that, and I also like to have a retreat-specific TBR, just so that I don't have to decide on the day what I'm going to read and then go and find the book, buy the book, anything like that. I can have all of those books in advance. Once you've planned your retreat, you then have it, and it could be fun to put in some reading-related memory keeping. Now, this doesn't have to be related to a reading retreat, it could be related to a reading challenge, it could be related to a particular book that you've read. I've just stuck in a couple of pictures from a recent reading retreat we had, and you could take down some notes, do some journaling, or just do some collage work. Our next idea here though is what I'm calling secret reads, and these are for the books that maybe you don't necessarily want to admit that you've been reading or admit that they're on your TBR. I don't personally have this problem, but if you want to be a little more sneaky about it, you can put in a little tip in and then have those underneath the tip in so that they are a little bit more hidden. I've disguised these ones with the PET tape so it's not quite as visible that we have the flip up here. But flipping over, and our next idea is a popular reads takedown. Now this could be done in a way that is either enthusiastic or spiteful is how I'm gonna word it. So maybe there's a bunch of popular reads in the genres that you like and you want to see if it's kind of like worth the hype. Maybe you're reading them with a lot of skepticism to see if they're actually worth all of the praise they're getting online, or it could be you're very excited about these and you want to get through as many as possible. Whichever one that is, having a space in your journal dedicated to the list of those could be kind of useful for keeping track. I've just done these ones as a list, but it would also be a lot of fun to have them with the little cover pictures as well. Another just for fun layout you could include would be something related to reading subscription boxes. So possibly if you're trialing out different reading subscription boxes, trying to figure out which one might be right for you, you can write down who is the box provider, or what is the box called, and maybe even rate the box based on how much you enjoyed the items in it. This could also be set up kind of like a memory page, so taking little pictures of all of the items and sticking that into your reading journal, or we could just do the list format like we have here. Another page idea that you might want to put in your reading journal is related to second language reading. So if you're trying to learn another language, a good way can be kind of exposing yourself to that language used in different contexts. So this could be trying to read some of your favorite reads in a different language, or it could be ones that originate out of the country for which that language is the native language. I've set this one up as a little table, so writing out what the language is and the title of the read. Just a good way to further immerse yourself in that language. Another just for fun layout is something like a read related collage. So this is where once you've finished a book or a series and you just want to kind of live in that space a little bit longer, find a bunch of pictures for yourself online or in your stationery stash and make a collage related to that book or series. You can also combine this with doodles if you prefer, if you're not really into collaging. Maybe make an art piece dedicated to that book or book series. And it could also just be a kind of fun quote page as well, especially if there's a particular quote or a couple quotes in the book that really resonated with you. You could put those on a page to commemorate your time with that book. Flipping over though, and our next idea is including reading maps in your journal. Now these could be actual like book maps that are from books that you've read, or it could be something like this, which is one that I made, which I just thought was a bit of fun. I've effectively populated it with a bunch of different reading tropes or like reading circumstances, like the Towers of Duology or the Awkward Love Triangle Island. We have the Book Talk Vortex, the Slow Burn Crater, all of those kind of things. This one's also available in the shop as a printable, and it could be the kind of thing that you color in different spaces based on what you've been reading. So like color in the age gap when you have a book that kind of leans into that trope. Color in the indie aisle when you read a book that's been independently published. Or in my journal, I just have it right up the front as a fun kind of introduction to my reading journal. As said though, that one's in the shop and you can find it linked in the description box. Hopefully this video gave you plenty of ideas for your next reading journal setup. I certainly know that mine is going to have a lot of these in it. And this list is by no means exhaustive. I mean, we didn't do 12 recs from 12 friends, or look at every potential reading review layout under the sun, or cover every single reading challenge. But if you are still on the hunt for more reading journal inspiration, then this video is the next one to check out. That one is my most recent reading journal setup, where I take you through all of the pages that I like to use in particular, and the way that I like to set them up for use. So click or tap on that one and I'll see you over there.